when we're in February or early March, not all the cows are calved. We're letting out 60-70% of the cows and they don't need a full allocation. This paddock will be divided into 3 to 4 hour allocations, and it will result in getting to the back of the paddock. Spur roadways are a relatively cheap way of getting these cows to the grass, and they don't require huge construction costs in terms of we can put these roadways just above the level of the field. They don't need much base material and a blinding material on top, because they're only going to be used by cows. There's going to be no machinery present on these roadways, and we can get away with a 1 to 2 metre width on these sections of roadway.
Increasing the level of grazed grass in the cow's diet is a key driver of profitability on Irish dairy farms. In order to achieve this, good grazing infrastructure is important to access all parts of the farm area and to ensure cow performance isn't compromised through lameness, etc. I'm joined today by Paul Maher, Walsh Scholar, to discuss farm roadway infrastructure on commercial dairy farms and how it can possibly be improved. Maybe, Paul, to get stuck straight into your own research project, and can you just outline for our listeners exactly what you were looking at within that project?
So we carried out a project in Teagasc Moor Park with my supervisors, Pat Toohey, Mike Egan and Michael Murphy. And we wanted to look at the grazing infrastructure, the current status of it on commercial farms. So we wanted to look at in 2 main sections, the first being the pasture allocation on farm in terms of our paddock size and the frequency, the number of grazings the cows are getting off each individual paddock. And then we wanted to look at our roadway infrastructure in terms of what distance cows are walking, what the current surfaces are on farm roadways, and what impact that's having on cow movement and in terms of efficiency of grazing infrastructure. So I suppose I'll start with the paddock design and pasture allocation. So I suppose there's 3 main pasture allocations on Irish dairy farms. We've 12-hour allocations, 24-hour allocations, and 36-hour allocations. And what previous research has told us is when we've 12-hour allocations, there is a greater potential for heifers to have reduced milk yield in their first lactation, and that's due to increased inter-animal competition when we're trying to achieve a low post-grazing sward height of 4 centimetres. And although we need our 12-hour allocation for the spring and autumn, during the main grazing season, we ideally want to be in a 24 and preferably a 36-hour allocation, because the first lactation animals are less restricted, and it's that infrequency of fresh feed is reducing the inter-animal competition. So with that in mind, we wanted to look at commercial dairy farms as what's the current status of this. And we selected 135 farms based on their pasture-based data, and there was 3,661 paddocks reviewed. And basically what we looked at was we were able to access the size of these paddocks on farm and the herd size of these farms. And if we break it down into herds greater than 250 cows and on herds less than 250 cows, what we saw was with herds less than 250 cows, 14% of paddocks were suitable for 12-hour allocation. So the rest were optimal for 24 or 36. But when we go above 250 cows, 46% of the paddocks are only suitable for 12-hour allocations. So this may be impacting on the milk performance of the first lactation animals within these herds. And we also saw there's an increase in number of paddocks per farm with an increase in herd sizes. So what this may mean is there's additional land blocks added to the grazing platform, but our paddock size hasn't changed to adjust for the increased herd size on these farms.
From what you've seen on farm, what could farmers do to maybe improve that? I suppose not only is it in terms of impacting on animal performance, as you say, but also even from a grassland management point of view, you've a lot more paddocks to try and manage to ensure they're at the correct cover. What could farmers do?
Yeah, I suppose the simplest thing is actually just to lift the electric fences or the permanent fences that are between some of these paddocks where we have these 12-hour allocations. If we just lift 2 wires, we can create these paddocks into 36-hour allocations. And it's very simple to do. It's literally just lifting the wires. And as you say, James, it'll allow easier management of these paddocks for whether it's fertilizer or slurry application or for taking out surplus bales. And also, when we do this as well, we're going to more than likely add a second water truck to these paddocks, where we've now created 1 large paddock instead of 3 individual paddocks. So therefore, that may help our water supply on farm as well.
In an ideal world, we'd probably have 15 or 16 paddocks on the farm, and they'd all be of equal size. But there'll be parts of the farm where you'd be fit to do that. Is that fair to say,
Yeah,
Paul? And there'll always be parts of the farm where you just can't manage to maybe hedgerows or whatever, and
that
it's going to have to be a 12-hour block. But if you're sort of saying if there is parts of the farm, farmers maybe assess that and work out,
yeah, I
can they make
suppose.
improvements?
Yeah, exactly. No, I 100% agree with that. There are parts of the farm that hedgerows are going to limit that. But I suppose what we've seen from the satellite images of these farms, there are a lot of cases where it is just an example of an electric fence that needs to be moved. Previously going into it, we may have thought that hedgerows may have been a limiting factor, but it's not a biggest factor as we previously thought. I suppose the best way of putting it.
Mm.
But yes, there is parts of the farm that will be limited by that, and also in terms of you mentioned paddock shape. Look, our ideal shape of a paddock is twice the length as the breadth in terms of twice the length of the paddock opposing the farm roadway. But again, in reality, that's not the way farms are laid out because of natural boundaries such as hedgerows. So we need to adjust our grazing infrastructure in terms of our roadway network and our spur roadway networks in particular to access these parts of the farms, which I'll come to in a moment.
So maybe before we move on to talking about roadways, Paul, what is the, I suppose, size required for a 36-hour grazing paddock per 100 cows?
Yeah, so for 100 cows, we're talking about 1.8 hectares with a pre-grazing yield of approximately 1,400 kilos. And for 24-hour allocations, that would be 1.2 hectares.
Yeah. So it's really in terms of farmers sitting down, taking the map, looking, is there areas where they can get into those 1.2 hectares, or ideally, as you say, 1.8 hectares, and there's always scope for improving that on at the individual farm level.
Exactly.
The roadways element then, Paul, I suppose firstly, how did you go about actually evaluating a farm roadway network on a commercial farm?
Yeah, so we looked at two parts on the farm roadway network. We first of all wanted to look at the distance cows are walking, and then we looked at the surfaces and the materials on farm roadways that cows are using. And just I'll briefly mention in terms of the distance walked per year. So we were able to calculate the distance in terms of meters, average distance to a paddock, and the distance in kilometers the cows are walking per year on farm roadways. So what we saw was herds of less than 100 cows are walking a mean of 386 kilometers per year. And for herds greater than 250 cows, this is 718 kilometers per year. But there's a wide range within each of those across all the herd size categories. In less than 100 cows, it goes from 197 kilometers to 662. And if we look at the herds greater than 250, it goes from 435 up to 1142 kilometers per year. So there's quite a range within each herd size category, and it comes down to farm layout as well.
Is that down to in terms of actual block of land, or does that come back to some of that roadway design and efficiency with regard to roadways as well?
There's two factors, I suppose. We looked at the farm size and the herd size, and the correlation with that, or the association. There was an R squared of about 0.48 or 0.45 for the herd size and milking platform size, but the main factor was the mean distance to a paddock, which was an R squared of 0.82. What that means, though, is, as you say, James, it's the efficiency of the roadway network, but also the position of the milking parlour within the grazing platform. And I suppose that's something that's almost out uncontrolled at this point in terms of that farm has been established, the farmyard has been established in that point, and we have situations on some farms where it's almost like a letter, where the farmyard is in the position of the post stamp, and the farm has spread out from that point. But again, they're just some of the factors that are affecting the walking distance on farm. But it's also important to mention that across all the farms we examined, the furthest any paddock was to milking parlour was 2.6 kilometres. And I suppose it might be thought anecdotally that this may affect on milk performance within the herd. And it may, if the cows are going there twice a day, as in previous research has showed, once we go over about 6.4 to 7 kilometres, that's where it can impact on milk performance. But generally, when we're below that threshold of 6 kilometres per day, the cows are generally able to make up that deficit in terms of energy requirements, providing we're walking on a level flat surface. Where we're walking on significant inclines, that will have a far greater impact on energy reserves than the distance walked, if that makes
Yep,
sense.
absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of then, you mentioned the surface. How were you assessing that at farm level? And I suppose what were your kind of key findings there from a roadway surface and roadway quality point of view?
Yeah, so we looked at 55 of these farms, went out and visited these farms, and we wanted to examine the surface conditions. So we created an index system here in Teagasc Moor Park, range from 1 to 5, where 1 is the poorest quality and 5 is optimal surface. And we also examined that in Moor Park in terms of will that impact on the cow movement? And there's a strong correlation between the indexes we have and the time it takes to move the herd along those surfaces. So where we have an index 1 surface, we tend to have a large clay content with deep pockets of clay, so or else a large stone requirement where the cows tend to walk in a singular file through this section of roadway network. It's generally totally unsuitable for animal movement, but there are situations on farm where these roadways are present. There's also generally tends to be a limitation on allowing water runoff to flow into adjoining paddocks, which results on water pooling on the farm roadway as well, which can deteriorate the farm roadway further. And then as we go up to index 2 and 3, we tend to have some section of blinding on the farm roadway. However, there still can be water pooling in the roadway or loose stones present. And index 5 in our system was a smooth, blinded surface of farm roadway where there are no loose stones present, no limitations on water runoff, and an optimal surface for animal movement. And where we had these roadways present on farm, we've seen an increase in speed in animal movement. And also there may be a reduction, previous research showed there may be a reduction in lameness within the herd where we have reduced loose stones present on the farm roadway.
What percentage of actual roadways fell into that category? We'll say optimum.
Yes, yeah.
4 or 5.
So basically what we found there was 14% of roadways fell into index 5 and 20% fell into index 4. So those roadways would be considered relatively good for animal movement. However, 24% of roadways were index 1, which is extremely suboptimal for animal movement. However, it is also important to note that these roadways tend to be, in general, tend to be on the periphery of the grazing platform. So they're on the edges, so they mightn't be used as frequently as some of the main sections of the farm roadway. And we also looked at the congestion points on farm roadways, and we found that 10% of the roadways we examined had to cross a public road, and that was broken down based on, again, their surface condition or their roadway width or water runoff potential. But again, as you mentioned, in terms of surface condition, there are a large proportion of suboptimal roadways on farm. However, when we looked at in terms of the position of these roadways within the farm, they tend to be further away from the milking parlour. Nonetheless, they are an issue on commercial farms. And the same when we looked at roadway width, the roadway width was generally about 70% of the recommended width for that herd size.
And in terms of surfaces, I suppose, what were the main limitations identified to
Yeah,
ensuring that the surface, will say, stays good and stays optimum for as long as possible?
yeah. Well, on the study farms we examined, one of the strongest associations between a factor and the surface condition was definitely the water runoff potential. So where we are restricting water runoff on farm roadways, we tend to have a poorer surface condition, and where we've very low or no restrictions on water runoff, we tend to have an optimal surface condition on farm roadway. Similarly, where we have a verge width of greater than 0.5 meters, we tend to have a reduction in surface condition. And this is due to cows walking excessive clay content onto the farm roadway and also bringing loose stones onto the farm roadway. Congestion points also tend to result in a reduced surface condition on farm. And this is due to either cows or also machinery wearing the base material and the blinding on these sections of the roadway. So again, I suppose the main factor I would advise any farmers is the water runoff potential. The first thing is that the farm roadway needs to be above any adjoining paddocks, and for two reasons. One is to prevent any water flowing from these paddocks onto the roadway, which will erode the surface material. And secondly, the water on the roadway needs to flow off on both directions off the farm roadway, because if it's allowed to flow down the farm roadway, it will erode the blinding material present.
So I suppose that's a key point. If people have sections of roadway, Paul, that are difficult to maintain, it's really about trying to get that up above maybe the paddock level and get that runoff off. Otherwise, you'll constantly be repairing that level of roadway, is what you're really saying to me.
Yeah, absolutely. If we don't have the roadway above the adjoining paddocks, we're almost fighting a losing battle. We need to have the roadways above the adjoining paddocks, and then we need to we need to remove verges which will restrict water runoff. They're the main points to improve surface condition on farm roadways.
And then if we are reblinding maybe some of these roadways, and I'm tipping into maybe the next piece in terms of roadway design, but repairing these roadways, how much blinding are we actually talking about
Yeah,
to repair
we're
these? I think maybe it's an issue on farms where there's too much blinding being used in cases.
Yeah,
Would
there
that be
is,
true?
and that actually occurred on a couple of farms we visited where they had excessive blinding. So we're only looking for about 25 mil, which is almost just under like basically an inch is at most the amount of blinding we want to use. When we go above this level, above like say, 25 mil, we're going to result in like an almost Play-Doh effect on the farm roadway, where it tends to form like a clay content when it binds with excessive moisture on the farm roadway. So we're only looking for about 25 mil of blinding on a farm roadway, and it needs to be also cambered. And also, James Ward mentioned in terms of the camber on the farm roadways, we're only looking for a 5% camber on the farm roadways. Ideally, cows prefer to walk on a flat, level surface with a 0% camber, but we need to allow water to flow off the farm roadway. So 5% is the optimum. And if we go above 8%, we'll limit animal movement on sections of the farm roadway.
Roadway design, we've talked there about repair and surfaces. One thing maybe we haven't mentioned is what's the recommended width, we'll say from a herd size point of view, roadway width.
So for herds less than 75 cows, we're talking about 3.5 meters, and herds of 76 up to 125, 4 meters, 126 to 175, 4.5, and then under 225 cows, 5 meters, and 225 to 275, so around that 250 cow mark, we're looking at 5.5 meters. And then as we go up to 300 cows, it's 6 meters and 6.5 for 350 or more.
And that's for your main roadway network then. We
That's,
might
yeah,
come on to spur roadways later on.
that's absolutely, yeah. Look, we're talking about the main, and they recommend as well a meter wide as we head towards the milking parlour. But yeah, look, that's the main section of farm roadway. We have to be practical about this, where we have sections of silage ground, for example, which is used in the grazing platform. We can get away with a slightly narrower section of roadway on those sections of the farm.
Where they're not widely used, yeah. Some of the other questions when it comes to new roadways and roadway design, do you dig out or do you not?
Yeah,
That's one that often comes up.
this is it's very much a soil type and a weather factor in terms of whether they want the topsoil for the farm or they don't. You can dig out the farm roadway. There's no issue whether you take out if you are taking out the topsoil off the farm roadway. It is going to be slightly more expensive because that material is going to have to be replaced with a base material to bring that roadway above the paddocks where we started. So again, it comes down to a soil type issue, and also the main thing I would say to any farmer is to ensure the roadway ends up being above any adjacent paddock. And we need to as well allow that a grass verge will build up over time. So if we're 6 inches over a paddock, I don't see that as any issue. So to dig out a farm roadway, it comes down to a soil type and also a construction issue if they want the topsoil. But I wouldn't see a huge need to unless you want to, basically.
Should farmers be using where maybe ground conditions aren't as good? Should they be using the membrane under the roadway, under the gravel surface?
Again, talking to farmers, some farmers use it. It can be relatively, like say, it can be expensive. However, some farmers that have used it have found it very good. Other farmers have used it, they've found it okay. Again, it comes down to soil type. On softer soils or heavier soil types, they would recommend it, but it depends on the quality of the soil you're working with and the time of the year you're putting that material in. A strong base material would be strongly advised in terms of a 4 inch down or even a 6 inch down as a base, and then put a finer blinding on top of that material. But yeah, you can use the geotextile membrane.
I was just coming on to that in terms of have you a preference from the stone used in the construction of these roadways?
Yeah, so the stone used, to be honest, James, when talking to quarries and farmers, it's very much a local thing in terms of the stone that's in their local quarry, because we know that the cost of the stone is one of the most expensive parts of constructing a farm roadway. So, like, if the roadway is going to be used for the main section for machinery and it's the main section of the farm, we would prefer to use a 6 inch material first on a base and then build up from that. If it's only used for cows, we can obviously use a lighter material, or sorry, a more broken down material, a 4 inch down. But if we're going on the main section of the farm, a 6 inch down material would be advisable.
Then how important is that kind of rolling in process? Because sometimes
Yeah,
I hear farmers saying maybe oh, I didn't get to roll this section or tight for time or whatever it may be. How important is that?
I think it's one of the most important parts of the farm roadways to, particularly a vibrating roller, to compact the roadway material, and then we put on our blinding, and ideally we'd use a roller again on our blinding material after. As well, I've seen on some farms where the roadway has gone in too dry conditions where it doesn't bind together. So ideally, we do want some moisture between our stone material when we're putting it on the farm roadway, and then we want to use our vibrating roller to compact that material. And I would urge any farmers who are putting in farm roadways to use a vibrating roller to compact that material.
One other one that's cropping up a bit, and it's probably difficult conditions, grazing conditions last back end and this spring, and is the use of spur roadways. And what exactly do we mean when we're talking about spur roadways? We're after having a full conversation around the kind of
Yeah.
main roadway network. Spur roadways, what are they, Paul?
Yeah, so spur roadways are really for our spring period and our autumn period to get to the parts of the paddock which we necessarily generally can't get to in either February or March. And I think this spring couldn't have been a better example as to the necessity for these spur roadways on farms. So, like, particularly, we all have our dry paddocks in the farm, and sometimes these dry areas of certain paddocks can be at the back of the paddocks, not necessarily the front. And we're talking when we're in February or early March, not all the cows are calved. We're letting out 60, 70% of the cows, and they don't need a full allocation. And this paddock will be divided into 3 to 4 hour allocations, and it will result in getting to the back of the paddock. Spur roadways are a relatively cheap way of getting these cows to the grass, and they don't require huge construction costs in terms of we can put these roadways just above the level of the field. They don't need much base material and a blinding material on top because they're only going to be used by cows. There's going to be no machinery present on these roadways, and we can get away with a 1 to 2 meter width on these sections of roadway. But again, it's just to access the parts of the paddocks that we necessarily can't get to. And it comes back to our earlier point. Our ideal shape of a paddock is obviously 2 to 1, but in practical, that's not what's on commercial farms. So we can have long, narrow paddocks. And particularly if we have two long, narrow paddocks beside each other, a spur roadway between them would be very useful to access both paddocks. So we need to look at our roadways as well, and particularly our existing roadways. How can we use these roadways more efficiently in terms of accessing all parts of the grazing platform? And sometimes it's simple as an extra handpiece along the roadway into additional paddocks, or where a roadway goes down behind a hedge and it joins the back of a paddock. A simple 3 meter gap would allow the cows into the back of that paddock, and it's only needed for the spring and autumn. We're in August now, and the cows can come in and out through almost any gap on the farm, and there's no issue. But we have to remember it's for spring, for February and March, when it's the busiest period of the year, and we need to get cows to grass. That's where our spur roadways will really deliver, and also increase grass utilization, which drives profitability.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. There's a great point there in terms of maybe a farmer sit down and say, was there parts of the farm where they would have benefited from maybe some of those spur roadways and they're relatively cheap. And I suppose the big thing with any of these roadways is there's a massive payback in terms of the investment
There is
at
you
farm level.
Yeah, absolutely, in terms of grass utilization. But I think, James, as well, from being out on some commercial farms, our existing roadway networks, like say, we really need to look what we have at the moment, because a lot of farms have relatively good roadway networks, but we just need to add additional handpieces onto these roadways. And I don't see any issue with 4 to 5 entry points along a roadway into one paddock, because it's very easy this time of year to only use 1 to 2 entry points. But we need to think in wet March just went out. The back end of that paddock is a dry area. The cows can go in and graze that and come out, and it reduces poaching damage on the front entry points. And that's a key point I've seen on commercial farms, is just to open up additional entry points into these existing paddocks. And then obviously our spur roadways, I'd always advise spur roadway to divide land blocks further. The whole idea of the roadway network is to divide the farm into grazable sections in suboptimal grazing conditions. That's what we need to do with our spur roadways, is to access all parts of the farm for 3 to 4 hours grazings.
Very, very good. Final question, just with regard costings, any idea in terms of up-to-date costings per meter run or roadway, and where are they now, maybe compared to where they were 2 or 3 years ago?
Our latest calculations in the last couple of months have shown that, like say, for a 3.5 meter roadway, we're talking about €32 a meter for construction costs and our stone material. And then for a 4.5 meter, it goes up to €42, and a 5.5 meter is €51. Now, previous quotations would have been about €18 to €24 for a 4 meter roadway. So we've gone up about 30% on our previous costings for these roadways. And again, that's due to the cost of excavation costs and also the cost of the stone material being delivered. And again, if you're able to get stone on your own farm, it will significantly reduce the cost of construction of farm roadways, as it's one of the main costs involved in construction.
And even as we said earlier, that design piece, if we have to use fill to come back up to the ground level and then go again, that's going to have an impact on the cost as well. But it's just that farmers are aware that costs, as you say, have increased all by about 30%, which is in line with where we look at general costs across the board over the last couple of years, a 30% increase.
No, they have increased, but again, I suppose now more than ever, grass utilization is a key part that we need to focus on, and the return on investment is still very strong for these investments.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I want to thank you, Paul. A big run through there in terms of your own study, as you say. I suppose to summarise, paddock layout, and can farmers have a look at your own farm? Can you get more 36-hour paddocks in there? There'll definitely be parts of the farm where you can. And then it's making best use of existing roadways, improving those surfaces, and then maybe adding spur roadways or that external roadway network to improve that kind of grass availability in those difficult periods in the spring. So that's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, folks. I want to thank you again, Paul, for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.